All right, groovy cats and kittens, imagine this. You wake up in the heart of a 1960s hippie commune. You roll over in your humble shack, squint at the sunlight creeping through the cracks in the wooden walls, and try to clear your head. You're disoriented. What year is it? 1968? 1969? Nope. It's not a time-traveling trip to Woodstock, or a flashback to the summer of love. It's your life now. But before you can get too comfy, let me tell you something important. You wouldn't last a day in the 1960s as a hippie. And I'm not talking about just the rough sleeping arrangements, or the fact that you smell like a patchouli-scented swamp. I mean, in the real world, the hippie movement was built on more than flower crowns, and free love it was born from some very specific historical events and deep cultural currents that shaped the way people viewed themselves, their country, and their future. The late 1960s were a time of intense political and social upheaval, and let me tell you, if you thought just walking barefoot on the grass was going to cut it, you were in for a rude awakening. The Vietnam War, which began in the 1950s but really kicked into gear in the mid-60s, was at its peak by 1968. Thousands of American troops were stationed in Vietnam, fighting a war that many of them didn't fully understand, and that many Americans didn't want them to fight. The military draft was in full swing, and young people, particularly those who became the backbone of the hippie movement, were resisting being sent off to die in what they considered a pointless war. Protests erupted nationwide, culminating in tragic events like the Kent State shooting in 1970, where 4 students were killed by the Ohio National Guard during an anti-Vietnam War demonstration. The anti-war sentiment was a key factor in the rise of the hippie counterculture, and it was a driving force behind their desire to reject mainstream American values. But let's step back a moment before you start assuming the 1960s was just one big, angry protest. Oh no, it was so much more than that. The birth of the hippie movement was deeply intertwined with the rise of a generation who felt disillusioned with the societal norms of their parents. These baby boomers were coming of age in a post-World War II world that was rapidly changing. The 1950s had been a time of prosperity, but it had also been a time of conformity. Everyone was expected to fit into a neat little box of suburban living, going to college, getting married, and having kids by a certain age. But by the early 1960s, the world was changing fast. The civil rights movement was making waves, as activists like Martin Luther King Jr. and Malcolm X fought for racial equality in the face of segregation. Historical context: civil rights movement. On top of that, the sexual revolution was gaining steam. People were starting to realize that, hey, maybe they didn't have to follow the same old rules about love, marriage, and sex that had been passed down for generations. And let's not forget the space race. In 1969, the US landed on the moon, and for a brief moment, the world seemed full of endless possibilities. For a lot of young people, all these changes left them feeling empowered, but also confused. They didn't want to live in the shadow of the past, and this desire for change led them to search for alternatives. And that's when the hippie movement was born. So, there you are, waking up in your commune in Northern California, or maybe somewhere in the countryside, feeling one with nature, or at least pretending to be. You step outside and see your fellow hippies, all lounging in a patch of sun, barefoot and covered in what can only be described as earthy clothing, probably made from hemp. They're smiling, laughing, talking about the revolution and how they're going to change the world. But the truth is, you're feeling a little overwhelmed. Let's talk about that commune for a second. These weren't just laid-back hangouts where people were chilling out and playing guitar. Communes were often small, self-sustaining communities built around shared resources. People grew their own food, made their own clothes, and believe it or not, tried to build a life outside of the capitalist system they were rebelling against. But, my friend, don't get it twisted. While many communes were built on ideals of love, peace, and harmony, they were also not without their share of hardships. For one thing, there was no running water in most of them. That's right. You'd have to haul your own water from a nearby river or, well, if you wanted to take a bath. And bathing? Well, that was an afterthought. Personal hygiene was hardly a priority when you were too busy singing folk songs about freedom and talking about cosmic energy. And speaking of songs, so yes, the music. If there's one thing that's undeniably tied to the 1960s counterculture, it's the music. The Woodstock Festival in 1969 became an iconic symbol of the movement, with nearly 500,000 people gathering to listen to bands like Jimi Hendrix, The Who, and Janis Joplin. It was a 3-day concert that went down in history as the epitome of peace, love, and music. And everyone in the hippie movement, from communes to urban centers, was listening to the same music that promised change. Songs like Blowin' in the Wind by Bob Dylan became anthems of resistance. But if you wanted to be a part of it, you needed to know the right songs. But here's the catch. Just like the rest of the hippie lifestyle, this musical revolution wasn't always as peaceful as it appeared. There was a heavy reliance on drug use, particularly marijuana and psychedelics like LSD, to enhance the experience. And while there's no denying that music has the power to bring people together, the unregulated use of drugs in the 1960s led to some seriously wild and sometimes dangerous behavior. Not everyone in the hippie movement was into drugs, but they sure weren't in short supply. Now, let's get back to that commune breakfast. Don't think I forgot about it. You're handed a bowl of organic granola, and trust me, this stuff is as dry as your sense of optimism after 3 days without a real shower. You munch on it while trying to keep up with your fellow commune members who are talking about finding inner peace and embracing the spirit of the earth. You can't help but wonder, as you chew your gritty breakfast, what exactly did I sign up for? But the truth is, this commune experience, like most of the 1960s hippie movement, was rooted in the notion of rejecting mainstream society in favor of building a new world. They rejected the materialism of the 1950s, the rigid class systems, and the profit-driven motivations of the time. But in doing so, they also embraced certain challenges, like limited access to food, shelter, and modern conveniences. And while many commune members had the best of intentions, the reality of this life, one of communal living, shared resources, and spiritual awakening, wasn't always as idyllic as they made it seem. But let's keep going, shall we? As the day goes on, you eventually find yourself stuck in a conversation with that same guy who was singing Kumbaya earlier. He starts going on and on about the importance of living sustainably and how everything you use should be recycled. You nod along, trying not to notice that his sandals are made from old tires, and his shirt, well, it was probably a towel at one point. And then, right in the middle of this very deep and philosophical chat about zero-waste living, you spot the commune leader who, by the way, looks like he's auditioning for the role of Gandalf in a Lord of the Rings remake, sitting on the porch, strumming a guitar and humming to himself. He's leading a meditation session in complete silence, which sounds peaceful until you realize there's no hot water, no cell service, and you're on a spiritual journey that's starting to feel more like an existential crisis. Let's be real. Being a hippie in the 1960s wasn't all love, peace, and freedom. It was an intense response to the social and political landscape of the time, a world filled with war, civil rights struggles, and economic inequality. These young people believed they could change the world, and in many ways, they did, but it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. Many of them had to face some of the toughest realities of living outside the system. Communes were often difficult, and while their ideals were noble, the reality was a lot more complicated. And speaking of complications, let's talk about the real reason you wouldn't last a day in the 1960s as a hippie. The lack of basic hygiene? Check. The constant, ever-present smell of incense and patchouli? Definitely. The communes that ran on good intentions but often crumbled under the weight of unrealistic expectations? You bet. The history of peace and love? Well, it was never as simple as it sounded. All right, now that you're feeling the full force of the hippie commune, let's dive deeper into the cultural and historical upheavals that made this lifestyle feel so revolutionary. I mean, here you are, thinking you're going to experience nirvana while picking wildflowers and reciting mantras. But this isn't just about the sun-drenched, flower-filled utopia you've imagined. Oh no, my friend. It's also about the political landscape, societal change, and an entire generation's attempt to redefine reality. And it's not all fun and games, far from it. Let's take a step back, way back, And talk about the big picture. The hippie movement didn't just emerge out of nowhere. It was reactionary, a response to the world's chaos, and a protest against everything the previous generations had accepted. They were rejecting the monotony of the 1950s, where conformity ruled, and where every man wore a suit and every woman had a life goal of producing 2.5 children. You know the drill. Nuclear families, suburbia, white picket fences, and no one questioning the status quo. But in the 1960s? Oh, that status quo was getting questioned big time. The Cold War was underway, with tensions between the US and the Soviet Union escalating every minute. And the looming threat of nuclear annihilation was a daily fear for many Americans. Meanwhile, civil rights protests were growing in intensity as African Americans fought for basic equality in the face of institutionalized segregation. Historical context: civil rights movement. People were being arrested, marched, and brutally attacked simply for demanding equal rights. Meanwhile, the United States was locked in a war with Vietnam, where young soldiers were being sent to a foreign country to fight a war that seemed to have no clear purpose. To say this created a sense of anxiety and rebellion is an understatement. Many in the youth generation looked at the older generation, those who went through WWII and came out ready to embrace a comfortable life, and said, "We want no part of this." This mindset was reflected in the hippie movement, and it was reflected in their style too. When we think of the 1960s hippie, we often picture them wearing tie-dye shirts, bell-bottom jeans, and maybe a few flower crowns. But underneath that flowery aesthetic was a rejection of consumerism, materialism, and everything mainstream society valued. They were literally dressing in ways that screamed, "We're different, and we're proud of it." Now, let's be clear, while the hippie movement was rooted in a desire for peace and love, it didn't mean they all lived the good life. Far from it. In fact, the reality of living as a hippie in the 1960s was far less glamorous than you might think. If you thought you could just show up in your homemade tunic and immediately find yourself, think again. Sure, there were some communes that were genuinely utopian, where people lived by principles of shared wealth, love, and creativity. But for the most part, life wasn't all about blissed-out moments by the fire. As a hippie, you quickly realized that things like food and shelter were constant issues. And while the idea of living off the grid might sound appealing on the surface, the reality was far more gritty. I'm talking about waking up every morning with a rumbling stomach because, guess what? It's hard to grow all your own food on a small patch of land that's constantly being raided by insects and wild animals. It's also difficult to build a community based on shared resources when, well, you're all still learning how to share. Some communes had strict rules about property, like how everything's for the collective. But in practice, people still fought over food, land, and most importantly, toilet paper. Don't even get me started on that. But there's another side to this. The hippies were about experimentation. It wasn't just a way of life, it was a conscious choice to challenge everything society had told them was normal. And I'm not just talking about their fashion or diet. The counterculture also experimented with their own version of spirituality. Sure, they were heavily influenced by Eastern philosophies, Buddhism, Hinduism, Taoism, but they also created a sort of do-it-yourself spirituality. Meditation, yoga, chanting, crystals, these were all embraced, often without any understanding of their origins. It was more about the feeling than the actual knowledge. In a way, the hippie movement turned spirituality into a consumer product. You could buy your chakras in a kit, or you could attend an impromptu love-in in a park where everyone would chant about peace, love, and, yeah, you get the idea. At its best, this led to real spiritual growth for some. At its worst, it turned into a big ol' hippie cliché. But what about the music? The music. This was the heartbeat of the 1960s counterculture. You can't talk about hippies without talking about the influence of music. And it's safe to say that the entire movement would have crumbled without the soundtrack of that generation. Music became an expression of everything the hippies stood for: rebellion, peace, freedom, and love. Some of the greatest and most innovative musicians of the time, like Bob Dylan, Jimi Hendrix, and Janis Joplin, shaped the sound of the hippie movement. Bob Dylan's "Blowin' in the Wind" became an anthem of protest, challenging the government and questioning the war in Vietnam. Meanwhile, Jimi Hendrix was on stage at Woodstock, delivering some of the most legendary performances in music history, all while his audience cheered, "Make love, not war." You can bet that every one of those musicians knew what was going on outside of their performances. There was a big political shift happening, and they were right there in the thick of it. Now, let's talk about drugs. I'll be honest, drugs played a major role in the 1960s counterculture, particularly psychedelic drugs like LSD and magic mushrooms. The idea was to expand the mind, connect to the cosmos, Oz, and find enlightenment. There were some who genuinely believed that psychedelics could help them understand the mysteries of life and the universe. And for a time, there was a deep connection between the hippie movement and the psychedelic revolution. But let's be real for a second. LSD wasn't all good vibes and rainbows. There were plenty of stories about people going on bad trips, losing their minds, or even damaging their psyches forever. It was a roll of the dice, and not everyone came out the other side unscathed. It's easy to forget that the carefree love and peace weren't always the reality for those experimenting with mind-altering substances. So, imagine this after a long day of meditation, music, and let's say some very questionable, mind-opening substances. You're winding down in your hippie commune. Maybe it's around a fire, or maybe it's just under a canopy of stars. The truth is, you're probably feeling very confused. Is this it? Is this my life now? You've got the peace, you've got the love, but you also have the reality of surviving with very little in the way of comfort or convenience. When the night falls, you're reminded of how hard it is to live without plumbing, electricity, and central heating. You can't just go to the store and pick up a loaf of bread. You've got to grow it, grind it, bake it, and hope it doesn't get eaten by the raccoons before you get to it. It's not all sunshine and rainbows. And even worse, what if the system you're rebelling against comes for you? With the rise of the FBI's surveillance programs during the 1960s, especially targeting groups like the Black Panthers and anti-Vietnam War activists, it wasn't unheard of for the government to step in and squash the so-called radical movements. The establishment wasn't going to let an entire generation turn the system upside down without a fight. At best, this created an air of paranoia in the counterculture. At worst, it led to intense government crackdowns on activists, protesters, and even musicians. People were arrested, harassed, and subjected to surveillance in ways we wouldn't even think possible today. So, while you're out there growing your organic tomatoes and talking about peace, you might also be receiving a visit from the local law enforcement, reminding you just how quickly your utopian lifestyle could unravel. But let's not focus on the grim realities for too long. The counterculture did change things. It set the stage for the civil rights movements of the future, for the feminist movement, for environmentalism, and for countless other social changes. The hippies might have looked like they were just dressing funny and listening to weird music, but they were part of a movement that questioned and ultimately reshaped American society. So, would you have lasted a day in the 1960s as a hippie? If you could survive the lack of modern conveniences, the struggle for food, the paranoia of living on the fringes of society, and the constant philosophical questioning, maybe, but for most people, well, let's just say the 1960s were a lot harder to live through than they looked in the Flower Child movies. Welcome back, my groovy friend. By now, you're probably starting to feel the weight of the 1960s cultural and political shifts. But now we're about to really kick things into high gear. So buckle up. Let's talk about the Summer of Love. Sounds fun, right? The year is 1967. And San Francisco is the epicenter of a movement that is as spontaneous and free-spirited as the people who were part of it. And you? You're right there in the thick of it, walking through the golden streets of Haight-Ashbury, the mecca of the hippie movement. You've traded your regular clothes for tie-dye shirts. You've embraced the concept of love, peace, and understanding like a mantra, and you've probably forgotten how to keep track of time. You're part of a revolution. The Summer of Love wasn't just a blip in the timeline of history. It was a cultural explosion. Hundreds of thousands of young people from across the country flocked to San Francisco in search of a new way of living. The event was symbolic of the larger hippie movement. It was about rejecting the norms of the older generations. It was about embracing free love. It was about, well, embracing anything that wasn't the establishment. San Francisco, particularly the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood, became the epicenter of this revolution. The streets were alive with music, peace rallies, political protests, and, let's be honest, plenty of LSD. This was the moment when the hippie movement went from fringe to mainstream. People who had been living in communes and experimenting with alternative lifestyles suddenly found themselves at the heart of the mainstream's attention. But let's not get it twisted. The media didn't portray the summer of love as a peaceful, flower-filled utopia where everyone sat around singing folk songs. Oh no, the government, the police, and even regular folks were keeping a watchful eye on what was happening. The media painted the hippies as dangerous radicals, and some people were terrified that these long-haired youths were going to destroy the very fabric of American society. But that was exactly the point, wasn't it? The hippies weren't trying to fit into the fabric of society. They wanted to create their own fabricone based on freedom, love, and the rejection of materialism. They weren't interested in joining the rat race of middle-class suburbia. They wanted to escape the monotony and embrace a world where individuality, creativity, and spirituality could be the focus. The Summer of Love wasn't just about the flower crowns and the music. It was a protest away for young people to say, we don't want to be a part of the system that sent us off to Vietnam. We don't want to be the next generation of conformists. We're not going to sit idly by while the world burns. For those of us living through this time, well, if we were born then, it felt as if we were on the edge of something huge, something transformative. And what transformed this movement into something even bigger? The music. By this point, the music scene was in full bloom, with some of the greatest acts of all time forming in response to the political climate. The Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and Janis Joplin, just to name a few, captivated audiences with their psychedelic sounds that reflected the mood of the time. At Woodstock, which was still a couple of years away, the iconic symbol of the hippie movement would solidify itself in history, as the music became synonymous with the larger movement of peace and love. But wait, you thought being a hippie was all sunshine and peace, right? Not quite. Let's talk about the reality of the Summer of Love. By the summer's peak, the streets of Haight-Ashbury were flooded not with the free-spirited, fun-loving revolutionaries, but with crowds of people who were mostly there for the free food and the low-cost living. The problem? There were far too many people, and while the dream of a peaceful community lived on, the influx of people in San Francisco created issues: overcrowding, unsanitary conditions, and an overwhelming amount of people needing food, shelter, and medical care. In other words, the dream was becoming a logistical nightmare. For every hippie who was genuinely seeking peace, love, and enlightenment, there were a few more who just showed up because, well, it seemed like the cool thing to do. The reality? You had more people sitting on the sidewalks, begging for food, dealing with mental health crises, or overdosing on substances that were far from mind-expanding. It wasn't all free love and good vibes. And don't even get me started on the government's response. They weren't just sitting idly by while the country's youth gathered in one place. The FBI, under J. Edgar Hoover's watchful eye, began spying on hippie activists, monitoring their movements, and even infiltrating their groups. The establishment was watching every move the counterculture made. They feared this rebellion was more than just youthful angst. It was the potential of an entire generation turning against the system. Despite all of this, the Summer of Love had its moments. The music festivals, the free-thinking communes, the art, the spirituality, all of these aspects became deeply ingrained in the fabric of American culture. The idea of peace, love, and harmony became the catchphrase of a generation, and, even though not everyone in the movement fully embraced those ideals, the dream lived on in the cultural shifts that would follow. But here's the thing. No matter how dreamy it seemed, it wasn't all rainbows and butterflies. For every iconic moment, there was a dark side. The pressures of constantly fighting against societal norms wore down the energy of the movement, and eventually, the magic began to fade. The idealism of the Summer of Love turned into something that felt less like a utopia and more like a tragic experiment. So, let's say you've been living it up in the Haight-Ashbury neighborhood. You've seen the street performers. You've danced barefoot in the grass to the sound of the latest folk tune. You've even found a nice little commune to crash at. But at some point, The high from the music and the vibe wears off. And what you're left with is the harsh reality of trying to make it in a world that's constantly watching you, judging you, and let's be honest, laughing at you. You begin to question if all the protest and rebellion is actually getting anything done. The police are still cracking down. The establishment is still in charge. You're still struggling to grow enough organic vegetables to make a decent meal. And, let's face it, you've probably had at least one run-in with the authorities by now. You might even find yourself getting arrested for the crime of simply being a hippie. After all, the culture of civil disobedience that started with Martin Luther King Jr. and his followers eventually bled into the hippie movement as well. But when you, the one wearing the peace symbol and singing, "Give peace a chance," get arrested? Yeah, that's the true test of your commitment to this whole changing the world thing. But let's not forget the bigger picture. The Summer of Love is remembered as one of the defining moments of the 1960s. The protests, the politics, and the music didn't just exist in a vacuum. They were part of a larger, global revolution that was reshaping the way people thought about everything. And no matter how difficult it was, it set the stage for the movements of the next several decades. Civil rights, feminism, environmentalism, and anti-war activism. In the end, whether you stayed for one summer or got swept up in the counterculture for years, the 1960s marked a turning point for the United States. It was a time when an entire generation said, "We can do better." And while you probably would have faced some serious challenges trying to live the life of a hippie, you would have also experienced firsthand the power of rebellion, art, and collective consciousness in changing the world. All right, you're still here, but reality's starting to creep in. The psychedelic wonderland of Haight-Ashbury may have been fun, but the world around you is starting to get really complicated. You've got this whole love, peace, and no war mantra going strong, but the American government has other plans. The Vietnam War is in full swing, and whether you like it or not, it's soon going to be knocking on your door. Picture it, you're chilling in a commune, maybe plucking your guitar and singing along to Bob Dylan's latest protest ballad, when suddenly you get a letter. It's from the government, the dreaded draft notice. You've heard the stories, seen the headlines, and had the nightmares. If you're a man between the ages of 18 and 26, Uncle Sam is now your biggest problem. But let's face it, being a hippie in the 1960s is not exactly the best look for a military career. You know the deal. Long hair, peace signs, anti-war protests. Yeah, it's not quite the perfect soldier vibe they're going for. But here's where it gets interesting. Avoiding the draft wasn't as easy as just growing out your hair and burning your draft card. No, this was serious business. The Vietnam War was one of the most divisive conflicts in American history. On one hand, you had the government pushing for more soldiers to fight, and on the other hand, you had everyone else, the students, the activists, the artists, and yes, the hippies saying, "No way, we're not going to this war." The idea of sending young Americans to fight in a distant, unfamiliar country didn't sit well with the rising counterculture, and the protests became bigger, louder, and harder to ignore. Now, let's say you're lucky enough to avoid the draft notice altogether, because maybe you're a conscientious objector, or maybe your number just doesn't come up. You can still feel the tension building around you. You're in the middle of a cultural battle, with soldiers being sent off to war and returning home to a country that didn't quite know how to deal with them. You've got families torn apart, friends either going to war or getting out of it, and the weight of it all hanging over you like a heavy, acid-drenched fog. While you're busy fighting off the draft with peace symbols, anti-war slogans, and your best flower power persona, the rest of the world seems to be shaking from the sounds of protest music. Think about it. You're living through the birth of some of the most iconic protest songs in history. Whether it was Bob Dylan's "Blowin' in the Wind," which made you question the very nature of freedom, or Edwin Starr's "War, What Is It Good For?" that made it clear that war was indeed good for nothing. The music of the era spoke louder than words ever could. Let's not forget the songs that gave your generation a voice. "Give Peace a Chance" by John Lennon, "Fortunate Son" by Creedence Clearwater Revival, and of course, the anthem for all anti-war efforts, "Where Have All the Flowers Gone" by Pete Seeger. These were your protest anthems, the soundtrack of a generation that believed they could change the world with a few chords and a lot of passion. But even with all the protest music, the reality of the Vietnam War hit close to home. The war was televised, and suddenly, you were watching people your age, your peers, get sent off to fight. The images of battle, the body bags, and the reports of soldiers returning home, traumatized, broken, and misunderstood, started to trickle into the public consciousness. And you, the good hippie who believes in peace and love, can't sit back and ignore it. You can't look away. But even though the hippie movement was large and loud, it didn't mean you had the answers for how to stop it. The sheer size of the anti-war movement was impressive. Hundreds of thousands of people marching in Washington, D.C., campus protests across the country, and massive rallies and sit-ins that practically brought the government to its knees. But while you may have been part of this massive movement, it didn't always feel like you were winning. The war didn't stop, the draft didn't go away, and young men were still being sent to die in a jungle halfway across the world. Now, if you were one of the lucky few who got away from the war, whether it was because of a deferment, because you were in college, or because you just plain skipped out to Canada. Yes, a lot of hippies went to Canada to escape the draft. If you were still living in a world that was divided, the counterculture was very much against the war, but there was also a backlash from a large portion of the public who believed in supporting the troops, regardless of how they felt about the war itself. The question of patriotism was a tough one, and it often felt like your generation was caught in a battle between what was right and what was expected. But let's be real. As much as you might have wanted to dodge the draft, the anti-war protests were incredibly important. They weren't just about avoiding military service. They were about standing up for something bigger than yourself. They were about questioning authority and challenging the status quo. And when you stood at the front lines of those protests, chanting, "Hell no, we won't go," you felt like you were doing something good, something worthwhile. You were part of something that could, just maybe, help bring the war to an end. But the war wasn't the only thing heating up in the 1960s. The political landscape was also shifting dramatically. President Lyndon B. Johnson, LBJ, had already escalated the war effort, and by 1968, he wasn't looking too good. The country was divided, and LBJ was losing the support of the very people who had once backed him. The political climate was volatile, to say the least, and you were right there, on the front lines of history, feeling the tension and watching as the government seemed to become more and more disconnected from the people. And yet, even in the midst of all this political turmoil, you felt empowered. For many young people, it was the first time they were truly feeling the weight of history. It wasn't just about the war, it was about freedom. It was about individuality. It was about saying, we have a voice, we have power, and we're going to use it. The music of the era may have started as a form of rebellion, but it quickly became a tool of change. And no matter how you felt about the war, the music united you. It gave you a sense of purpose, a sense of clarity. Now, let's get back to the you part of this. How did you survive all of this as a hippie? Well, it wasn't easy. The war loomed over everything, but so did the larger, more personal battle, the rejection of the system you were fighting against. As a hippie, the idea of joining the military, let alone being part of an imperialist conflict thousands of miles away, felt so wrong. But even if you managed to avoid the draft, your life still came with plenty of challenges: police harassment, media ridicule, and the struggle to just stay true to your ideals. But here's the kicker. No matter how hard it got, you stayed. You stayed because you knew this wasn't just about you. This was about all of us. You were fighting for peace, for the idea that we could all coexist in a better, fairer world. And no matter how many hardships you faced, the dream of that world kept you going. All right, it's 1967. The world's buzzing, and you've heard all the talk about the summer of love. You've got your flowers in your hair, your peace sign necklace around your neck, and you're ready to head to San Francisco. Let's face it, there's no place better to embody your inner flower child than Haight-Ashbury, the heart of the hippie revolution. It's not just a neighborhood, it's the center of a cultural storm. Thousands of hippies are flocking to this colorful, eccentric area, hoping to bask in the collective groovy energy that's about to change the world forever. But before you rush off thinking it's all sunshine and free love, let's break it down. Sure, It sounds like paradise. But, you might not be prepared for the reality. Imagine showing up in your most righteous tie-dye shirt, ready to join the celebration, only to realize that Haight-Ashbury is packed to the brim with thousands of other young people who've had the same idea. The streets are clogged with people, music is spilling out of every window, and the atmosphere is electrifying. It feels magical, like anything is possible. But here's the catch. As you dance under the stars, enjoying the free spirit of the moment, you'll soon notice the cracks starting to appear. Because here's the truth about the summer of love. It wasn't as perfect as the songs made it sound. Sure, there was free love everywhere, but there was also a whole lot of free, well, drugs. And by drugs, I mean more than just your run-of-the-mill marijuana. There was a whole cornucopia of substances to experiment with. LSD was everywhere. You could trip your mind into oblivion just by talking to the right person. Heck, you could walk into any gathering, and someone would probably offer you a dose. But, and here's the big but, LSD wasn't some magical escape from reality. No, it was a hallucinatory experience that could flip your world upside down if you weren't ready for it. You'd be sitting in the park, basking in the sunlight, and then bam, the trees start talking to you. And, spoiler alert, they're not exactly giving you sound advice. But if you could roll with it, you'd see the world in a completely different light. If you survived the trip without being internally lost forever, you might have emerged with an entirely new sense of self. But for many, the harshness of the drug culture caught up quickly. But hey, it wasn't just about the drugs, it was about the community. The vibe of Haight-Ashbury was this free-spirited utopia where everyone was supposed to be equal. The idea was that you could drop everything, live communally, and experience a perfect society based on love, equality, and the pursuit of personal freedom. No money, no rules, just people living together in harmony. But here's the thing. It wasn't as peaceful as you might have hoped. The neighborhood was under siege. By 1967, Haight-Ashbury wasn't just the charming artistic hub it once was. As more and more hippies moved in, the area quickly became overrun with people who were just as desperate for a taste of that countercultural freedom, only some weren't prepared to live the life they were selling. Communes started popping up, but they often faced issues of overcrowding, crime, and limited resources. Food was scarce. The shelters were overcrowded. And here's a fun one, sewage systems were non-existent. The reality was that even the most idealistic hippies were finding themselves in a dirty situation, and the perfect world they were trying to create was slipping away as the population boomed. It wasn't long before the press began reporting on the growing tensions. The media started referring to Haight-Ashbury as a place full of free-spirited, unwashed, drug-addled youths who were living in filth and chaos. But as far as you were concerned, it wasn't about cleanliness. It was about freedom and community. Your hair might be dirty, but so was your spirit, in the best way possible. But there were some amazing things that happened during the summer of love. The music. This was the golden era of psychedelic rock. The air was thick with the sound of the Grateful Dead, Jefferson Airplane, and The Doors. These were your new best friends, and their music felt like an extension of everything you stood for. Freedom, expression, imagination. Music was no longer just something you listened to. It was something you felt in every fiber of your being. The famous Monterey Pop Festival in 1967 became a defining moment for the counterculture. The festival brought together the greatest artists of the time, and you were there, singing along with the crowd as Jimi Hendrix set his guitar on fire and Janis Joplin belted out, "Piece of My Heart." It was a moment of unity, where the crowd was one, floating in a sea of color and sound. But let's not kid ourselves, it wasn't all smooth sailing. By the time 1968 rolled around, the ideals of the summer of love were starting to fade. The war was still raging, and many were beginning to realize that love and peace didn't come quite as easily as the songs made it sound. The reality of the world outside the commune didn't match the dream. What started out as a utopian movement was now facing its darker side. In Haight-Ashbury, the free love and peace signs were slowly being replaced by a growing sense of disillusionment. There was a rise in crime, the pressure of living in overcrowded communes, and many people who were just experimenting with drugs found themselves struggling with addiction. The world wasn't ready for the complete breakdown of traditional values, and the pushback was coming fast. Even in the music world, tensions were growing. While the Woodstock Festival in 1969 was a grand culmination of the Summer of Love, it was also an overwhelming mess of mud, food shortages, and bad weather. The idyllic hippie dream of peace, love, and harmony was being pushed to its breaking point, and by the end of the decade, the world was no longer a peaceful commune. It was a battleground for societal values. So, here you are, a true blue hippie in the middle of the Summer of Love. You came for the experience, for the revolution, and it was great for a time. You were surrounded by thousands of people who shared your ideals, and in the moment, you felt connected to something bigger than yourself. You felt like you were changing the world, but the truth is, you wouldn't last forever in this haze of free love and psychedelic bliss. Reality has a funny way of creeping in. People go home, the music fades, and the world outside calls. As much as you wanted to believe that the Summer of Love was a permanent state of being, the 1960s were, in fact, a moment in history, a fleeting, vibrant, chaotic moment that could never be recreated. And for most of the people who lived through it, it was all about the journey. And as the 1960s came to an end, so did the illusion of peace and love, replaced by the harshness of the next decade, the 1970s. As you pack up your tie-dye shirts, your peace necklaces, and the remnants of your flower power era, you start to wonder, was it all worth it? Were you really changing the world? You might not have the answers, but you did learn one thing. The Summer of Love was a dream, one that looked great on paper, but was far harder to pull off in reality. And though the dream faded, the movement you were a part of will live on in history forever. You made it through, but the world outside? Well, that's a different story. So, you survived the Summer of Love. You danced barefoot in the streets. You mingled with the artists and poets, and you experimented with everything from free love to mind-altering substances. But now, as the year turns from 1967 to 1968, it's time to face the cold, hard reality. The world outside Haight-Ashbury isn't as welcoming as the peace signs made it seem. It's not all flower crowns and the sweet smell of incense. The nation's political landscape is shifting, and you're about to find out that not everyone's on board with your new way of living. The truth is, you've spent the last year blissfully unaware of just how deep the political divide is. While you were riding the highs of your collective utopia, the rest of the country was feeling a little less love and a lot more war. And here's the bombshell. 1968 isn't going to be your year. You've been sipping on the Kool-Aid of peace, love, and free love, but it's time for a reality check. The truth? America's in chaos. In 1968, the political climate in the U.S. is anything but groovy. While you've been living in the bliss of your commune, not paying taxes or contributing to the system, your government is sending hundreds of thousands of soldiers off to Vietnam, and public unrest is growing. The whole free love thing is starting to look less like a peaceful revolution and more like a chaotic, unpredictable storm. You thought the revolution was about love, but it turns out love isn't what's being discussed in Washington. Protests are erupting across the country. University students are throwing rocks at police officers during demonstrations against the war. The streets are full of people shouting for justice, equality, and an end to the bloodshed. Your peaceful commune feels like an oasis, but it's also starting to feel like an isolated one. The rest of America, it turns out, is not so in touch with the ideals you hold dear. You, too, are about to be caught in the backlash. Speaking of war, it's not just the bombs in Vietnam that are unsettling your flow. There's a war brewing in your own backyard, one you can't ignore no matter how much you try to live in a haze of incense and poppies. The cultural revolution you've embraced isn't just about hippies throwing peace signs anymore. This revolution is gritty. It's about societal change, about equality, and about an America that feels increasingly divided. So, how do you respond when your peaceful world is turned upside down? You double down, of course. You get louder, you get more vocal, you find new ways to protest. After all, the revolution is supposed to be about justice, right? The problem is, not everyone agrees with your tactics or your message. Enter the counterculture backlash. In 1968, the political atmosphere isn't just tensites dangerous. Your protests are no longer about groovy peace festivals. Instead, they're met with resistance, with tear gas, police barricades, and real-life repercussions. At the Democratic National Convention in Chicago, what was supposed to be a peaceful protest turned into a riotous, chaotic scene of violence, unrest, and confusion. This is a far cry from the peaceful images of love you imagined. This is real civil disobedience, and it's not going the way you hoped. And yet you persist. The 1960s weren't just about counterculture, they were also about fighting the establishment. You, as a hippie, might have been part of this noble movement, but you were also realizing just how complicated it all really was. No longer was the world about flowers in your hair. Now, it was about fighting for rights, for freedom, and for justice on a much bigger scale than you ever imagined. What you'll learn over the next year is that the hippie movement was built on ideals that were noble but incredibly hard to sustain. As love, peace, and flower power are spread across the globe, the revolution becomes a bigger, more intense movement. But this intensity starts to divide the once unified community. The idealism that once defined your movement is slowly being replaced by confusion, burnout, and sometimes outright hostility. You're not the only one feeling the pressure. The leaderless movement begins to splinter. The free love, the communal life, and the collective idealism start to crack. The communes aren't all rainbows and sunshine anymore. The challenges of maintaining peace in a world full of war start to take a toll on your spirit. What happens when your carefree world collides with the unrelenting chaos of modern society? So, you start to wonder, was it all worth it? Was your dream of peace and love a fantasy? Or was there something more substantial that you could achieve? You have two choices now. You can double down on your convictions and become a voice of dissent louder than ever before. Or you can start to slowly step away from the movement that brought you into this dream world to begin with. The truth is, by the end of the decade, things are about to change drastically. Your idyllic vision of the world, where peace reigns supreme, is about to face the biggest challenge yet. But don't go thinking that this means the end of your wild ride. The decade may have been full of intense challenges for the hippies, but it's also going to end on a high note. The counterculture movement will evolve, and while the Summer of Love may have been flawed in execution, it was also part of a larger wave of rebellion that would lead to serious societal shifts that would shape the generations to come. And, let's face it, you're still a hippie. You've got the flower crown, the peace necklace, and your love for everyone still running strong. You're resilient, just like the movement you joined. The battles may be tough, but you're still going to fight for peace in your own way. Your ideals may have been challenged, but that's what happens when you try to change the world. Sometimes, you have to fight for it. In 1968, the movement is already changing. The hippie dream is being replaced by a generation that's ready to shake up the system, not just love it. The world is going to be a little less easygoing and a lot more serious from here on out. But the seeds of your idealistic vision, they're still there, nestled beneath the surface of all the turmoil. All right, now we get to the tough part of your journey as a hippie in the 1960s. You've enjoyed the idealism, the free love, and the general good vibes that came with being part of the movement. But here's the thing about revolutions. They're never as easy as they look from the outside. By 1969, you can't deny it anymore. The world isn't nearly as accepting of your flower power lifestyle as you thought. The problem is, it's starting to feel like the war you were protesting against is creeping into your peaceful bubble. While you were dreaming of a utopia of free love, everyone else was caught up in the escalation of the Vietnam War. Your idyllic dreams of peace and harmony begin to feel out of place as the world continues to spiral into violence and destruction. Here's the bombshell. Peace and love weren't always as free as they seemed. In 1969, the world's most famous music festival, Woodstock, occurs, and for a brief moment, everything seems perfect. For those of you lucky enough to be there, it's a weekend-long orgy of music, arts, and mind-expanding substances. It's a massive gathering of like-minded individuals, all coming together to celebrate the idea of peace. It's the embodiment of your dreams. This is where you can feel the universal connection to humanity and the earth. But there's a problem. What Woodstock doesn't show you, what no one tells you in the haze of those acid trips, is that you're about to face a new generation of disillusionment. The hippie dream has been tested by politics, by war, and by an increasingly divisive world. The cultural revolution you've embraced isn't just a celebration of freedom, it's a confrontation of everything wrong with society. Sure, the music is great, but the same government that's funding the war in Vietnam is also the one that's doing everything in its power to shut down your attempts at social revolution. The peace and love movement, which was once your idealism, is now under attack. And that attack isn't just coming from your typical establishment, it's coming from inside your own movement. The more radical factions of the counterculture are starting to emerge, with their own ideas on how to fix the system, and they're not interested in singing songs about love anymore. So, you're beginning to notice cracks in the foundation of your movement. You, the idealistic hippie, might have spent years marching in the streets, chanting for peace, listening to Bob Dylan, and eating free food in the park. But, somewhere along the way, the world didn't change as quickly as you hoped it. Old. You've seen your friends get arrested during protests. You've seen some of your fellow hippies get caught up in violent demonstrations. And you've witnessed firsthand just how quickly peace can turn into anger when the government doesn't listen to your calls for change. By 1970, your dream of a peaceful society is feeling more and more like a fantasy. The counterculture is now at war with itself. Some are still calling for change, but others are starting to abandon the peaceful ideals of the movement in favor of something more militant. The rise of groups like the Weather Underground, who would resort to violence to fight the system, makes it clear that peace isn't the only game in town anymore. Suddenly, the hippie dream is overshadowed by something darker, something that's creeping into your consciousness: anger. Now, the beauty of free love and peace seems fragile. You start to notice that not everyone in the hippie community is in it for the love anymore. Many of them are just angry. Angry at the war, angry at the government, angry that their dream of revolution is turning into a nightmare of apathy and resistance. Your friends who were once embracing the free spirit of 1967 are now battling each other over how best to achieve peace. Can you still march in protest while remaining peaceful? Can you still sing songs about love when your own country is engaging in violence? And the worst part? You're starting to see the cracks in your own movement. Where once there was unity, now there is division. The radicalization of certain factions is threatening to undo the very essence of the hippie ideal, that love can solve everything. For the first time since you joined the movement, you're beginning to wonder, was it all worth it? The turning point comes in 1970, with the horrific event known as Kent State. On May 4th, Ohio National Guard soldiers opened fire on students protesting the U.S. invasion of Cambodia during the Vietnam War. 4 students were killed, and 9 others were injured. The images of young people lying dead on the ground sent shockwaves throughout the country. But it did something else too. It shattered the myth that the government would listen to peaceful protests. Kent State wasn't just an attack on students, it was an attack on the very idea that America could listen to its people without resorting to violence. The establishment had finally drawn its line in the sand. And it wasn't a peace sign. It was a rifle barrel. As a hippie, you can't avoid the implications. You've seen the headlines. You've heard the arguments. The country is getting increasingly divided, and the hippie movement is no longer as idealistic as it once was. There are those who have abandoned the dream of peace in favor of radical action. The question becomes, how do you reconcile your vision of peace with the world's growing chaos? Here's the kicker. By the time the 1970s really start to settle in, you're wondering whether the summer of love was just a pipe dream, a brief respite from the ever-looming forces of war and hatred. You can't even trust the symbols of peace anymore. The dove? It's been co-opted by every political faction imaginable, turning it into just another marketing tool. The revolution, it seems, has been commercialized. Now you're just left asking yourself one thing: is love really enough? Despite all of this, the movement isn't dead. In fact, it's alive in ways you never expected. As you march through the disillusionment of 1970 and beyond, you start to realize that the spirit of the 1960s didn't just die, it transformed. It wasn't about blind idealism anymore. It was about activism, real, raw activism. The hippies didn't just vanish. Their influence morphed into a new wave of environmentalism, women's rights movements, and civil rights activism. You may have traded your flower crown for a protest sign, but the core of your movement, your desire to see the world change, was still alive. It may have looked different, but the dream wasn't over. If the 1960s were all about the dreamy idealism of peace, love, and harmony, the 1970s were about the messy reality that came with trying to change the world. Welcome to the post-Woodstock world, where the era of free love slowly starts to wear thin and the weight of political activism really starts to take hold. It's now the 1970s, and you're no longer the carefree hippie you once were. The carefree summer of flower crowns and peace signs has given way to harder, more aggressive protests. What happened? How did the generation that once sang Imagine and marched for peace end up so politically charged? You're beginning to understand that just asking nicely for peace isn't going to cut it anymore. You've seen firsthand that your peaceful protests and love-filled messages haven't worked. The establishment is still entrenched in its warmongering ways, and now your very vision of a peaceful society feels stuck in a bygone era. After Kent State in 197, you and many of your fellow hippies realize that you can't simply hope for a utopia of peace anymore. What started as a cultural revolution with the idea of getting back to nature, celebrating freedom, and rejecting war has now shifted into a more raw and radical movement. More and more of your friends and fellow activists are pushing for action, real, tangible action. No longer are you just sitting around in communes singing songs of peace. Now, you're protesting. And sometimes, you're even willing to break the rules. By 1971, the counterculture has split into factions. Some are still sticking to the old ideals of free love, personal freedom, and peaceful protest. But others are increasingly radical. They're no longer looking for change through peaceful marches and music. They're looking for it through direct action. The counterculture, once defined by its rejection of the establishment, is now at a crossroads. You've got moderates who just want peace, and then you've got the radicals, like the Weather Underground organization, who believe that in order to achieve real social change, they must escalate the fight. This group, who got their name from their belief that the weather in America was ripe for revolution, advocated for violence, bombings, and direct attacks on the establishment. They believed that nonviolent protest had failed, and it was time to take the fight directly to the enemy. You can feel the tension in the air. It's as if the idealistic dream that united you all has split in two. Where there was once unity, now there's fragmentation. You're still holding on to the ideals of peace, but it's becoming harder and harder to ignore the growing unrest around you. In the midst of this radical shift, something crucial happens. The hippie movement doesn't vanish. Instead, it morphs. As the world of radical politics and revolution swirls around you, the concept of radical activism starts to take root in various sectors of society. What once began as a rebellion against the establishment now becomes a way of life for a new generation of activists who want to change the system. And though you may have been a flower child once, you start to realize that you can still live your ideals, but you need to shift the focus toward change, real, systemic change. By 1972, the political landscape is transforming rapidly. The civil rights movement, women's liberation, and now the environmental movement are leading the charge. The hippie dream of living in peace, communing with nature, and celebrating freedom is still alive, but it's evolving into something more strategic and pressing. You're starting to realize that revolution is no longer just about sitting around in communes or taking psychedelic trips. It's about political firepower. It's about joining forces with others who want to fight for a better world. As you watch the Watergate scandal unfold in 1972, it becomes clear that the political world is just as corrupt as you thought. It was the ultimate confirmation for a generation that had rejected the establishment. The Nixon administration was embroiled in the greatest political scandal in American history, and it felt like your protests, your activism, your ideals were finally being justified by mainstream history. The scandal marked a key turning point. It was the moment when the hippies, once just outsiders, became political insiders. With Nixon facing impeachment, you and your fellow activists started to realize that it wasn't just about rejecting the system anymore. It was about changing it from within. That meant running for office, making real political gains, and pushing for legislation that reflected the values of the counterculture. You had to be smart. You had to be strategic. You begin to realize that your rebellion can't just be about rejecting the status quo. It needs to be about building something new, whether it's advocating for environmental reform, civil rights, or gender equality. The spirit of activism you began with still burns in your chest, but now it's directed toward meaningful change. In the early 1970s, you might have still seen some remnants of the counterculture. You might have seen a few communes where people lived off the land, trading goods and services in a perfect little utopian bubble. But by the mid-70s, those communes had become less about survival and more about organizing for social justice. The hippies were no longer just flower children. They were activists, protesters, and radicals fighting to reshape the very structures that had tried to shut them down. But what's the cost of all this? With political activism becoming more intense, the joyous and carefree days of the summer of love start to fade. The songs about peace and love begin to feel tired, repetitive. You've spent the last few years arguing with your peers about the true meaning of revolution. Everyone has their own take on how to create a better society. And some of those takes have started to get downright dangerous. Radical politics isn't just about sitting in drum circles anymore, it's about being willing to challenge the very fabric of society. And when it comes to drugs, the free love and psychedelic experimentation of the 60s is now starting to see a darker side. It's no longer just about expanding consciousness. It's about using substances to fuel political resistance. The idealistic dream of peace and harmony has been replaced by a new generation of political warriors. The first generation to truly understand that peace doesn't always come without a price. You begin to see how the hippie movement influenced the way people think about social justice, civil rights, environmentalism, and equality. And you can't help but feel a little proud. You may have been a flower child once, but now you're part of a generation that changed the course of history, not just with songs of peace, but with political revolution. But the true lesson of the 1970s is that change is messy. It's never clean, it's never easy, and it's almost never quick. Your dreams of peace might have started with love, but now they're ending with action. And in that action, you realize one thing: revolution is just as complicated as life itself. The dream had to end sometime. And by the mid-1970s, it was becoming increasingly clear that the utopian vision of the 1960s was slipping through the fingers of the counterculture. You were no longer the wide-eyed flower child walking barefoot through lush meadows of hope. The times were shifting, and you, like many others, could feel it. The fading light of the summer of love was being overtaken by the harsh shadows of economic downturns, political disillusionment, and the unraveling of the very fabric of the hippie utopia. It's now the late 1970s, and you're not as hopeful as you once were. The energy, the optimism, and the idealism of your youth are starting to feel like distant memories, out of sync with the world around you. What happened to the peace, love, and understanding that once filled every conversation? What happened to the revolution that seemed within reach just a decade ago? The answer isn't simple, and it's not easy. The dream of the 1960s, a world where all men and women could live in peace, love, and freedom, was fragile from the start. It was built on ideals, on a belief that humanity could transcend its flaws and live in harmony with one another. But reality, as it often does, proved far more complicated. The first cracks in the dream appeared during the early 1970s. The war in Vietnam was still raging, and though the American military was beginning to withdraw, the casualties kept coming. The anti-war movement that had once been filled with energetic protests, songs, and optimistic chants had grown tired, its leaders frustrated, their voices strained. The horrors of war, the relentless images of destruction, and the political corruption surrounding it all had left people wondering if they had really made any difference at all. What had they accomplished, really? The war had ended in 1975, but it felt like victory had never been achieved for the peace movement. By now, the energy that had once flowed freely in Woodstock was replaced by the murky feeling of defeat. The country was in the midst of an economic crisis, stagflation, and an energy crisis had gripped America. Unemployment was rising, and wages were stagnant. The dreams of a prosperous and equal society felt more like pipe dreams, as the promise of the American dream slowly began to fade. Meanwhile, the counterculture that had once defined rebellion was splintering into factions. Some hippies remained committed to their ideals, continuing to live in communes, celebrating free love, and using marijuana as a symbol of freedom. But more and more, these pockets of hope began to feel isolated, disconnected from the world at large. They weren't changing the world anymore. They were barely surviving within it. Their utopia had become a self-sustained retreat from a society that seemed to be falling apart. At the same time, the political world was evolving, but not in the way hippies had envisioned. The counterculture's dream of a new, enlightened social order was slowly being drowned out by the rise of conservative politics. In 1968, the shock of the Democratic National Convention protests and the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. created a national mood of uncertainty and frustration. And in 1972, Richard Nixon's re-election brought a strong conservative agenda to the forefront. The Watergate scandal was a turning point. Nixon's resignation in 1974 marked the ultimate betrayal of the American people, confirming what the hippie movement had always suspected. The system was rigged, but even with the downfall of Nixon, the political landscape of America was moving in a more conservative direction. The idealism of the 60s gave way to the pragmatism of the late 70s. People were tired of idealistic rhetoric. They wanted results, and the hippie movement's call for social justice began to feel irrelevant to the more pragmatic generation that followed. The 1970s saw the rise of figures like Ronald Reagan, who began pushing for a return to traditional values, which stood in stark contrast to the counterculture's progressive agenda. For the hippie, this new shift felt like an all-out defeat. It was the end of an era that once seemed like it could reshape the world. The communes you lived in had become a distant memory, replaced by the rise of new right-wing ideologies that branded your ideals as unrealistic, utopian, and dangerous. As much as you tried to hang on to the old days, it was clear that the world had moved on. The counterculture's leaders were aging and getting older, and younger generations didn't fully understand what the 60s had been about. To them, your quest for peace seemed naive, perhaps even delusional. The economic hardships of the 70s made the idea of free love and peaceful living feel like a luxuriant, unattainable fantasy. The focus shifted to economic survival. People were tired of fighting for a dream that was never fully realized. By 1976, the final nail in the coffin seemed to come with the rise of the Sex Pistols and the dawn of punk rock. Where once there was a romantic idea of love and peace, now came the raw, angry rejection of everything the hippie movement had stood for. Punk was loud, rebellious, and angry, a direct counter to the flowery optimism of the hippies. Punk rockers wore torn clothes and shouted about anarchy while blasting the establishment with guitars that screeched louder than your protest chants ever could. And yet, this wasn't the end of everything you believed in. It was a transformation. The 60s dream may have been tarnished, but the ideas about freedom, individuality, and questioning authority were never fully erased. They simply adapted to the world around them. As much as the world around you changed, you were still a product of those early countercultural years. In the early 80s, you would watch as some of the biggest names of the 60s tried to reinvent themselves in the face of economic hardship, shifting social values, and the rise of a new generation. Some went into politics, trying to influence policy from within the system. Others turned to activism once more, trying to tackle new issues like environmental degradation, corporate corruption, and international inequality. But at the end of the day, you could feel that your era was over. You could feel it in the air, in the music, in the growing conservatism of the time. The optimism of the 60s had been swallowed up by the realities of adulthood, politics, and societal expectations. The summer of love had faded, and what was left was a generation struggling to find its place in the world. And yet, it didn't completely disappear. The messages of love, peace, and freedom didn't vanish entirely. Instead, they were repackaged for future generations. The 80s would see the rise of new youth movements. Some were subversive and countercultural in their own right, such as the grunge movement of the 90s. But the spirit of rebellion never fully disappeared. As you look back on the 60s and 70s, you realize that while the movement itself might have fractured, its impact on society was undeniable. You helped shape modern activism. The questions you asked about authority, the war, civil rights, and human freedom would continue to shape generations long after the dream faded. While the idealism of the 60s may have been replaced by the harsh realities of the 70s, it is clear that your generation set the foundation for much of the social justice movements that followed. You've made it out of the 1960s alive. Barely. Your hair's a little shorter now. Maybe your dye's a little faded. Maybe your dream of a utopian world where everyone shares tofu and no one pays rent has hit a few roadblocks. But something strange is happening. The world that once laughed at you is starting to borrow your ideas, or at least steal your slogans and repackage them in pastel. Welcome to the aftermath. It's the 1980s now. The Reagan era. Everything's neon. Everyone's talking about Wall Street. And the only thing more inflated than the economy is the hair. If you're still wearing bell-bottoms, people assume you're either homeless or doing a very dedicated bit. But look closer. There's a farmer's market in every major city. Organic food is booming. Everyone's suddenly into yoga, meditation, herbal tea, and questioning the government. Tie-dye t-shirts are in department stores. Everyone's worried about Mother Earth. You hear words like holistic living and conscious consumption in places that used to sell polyester suits. Hold up. Is this your fault? Yes. Yes, it is. Because the hippie movement didn't really diet, just changed clothes and took a marketing job. Your revolution got rebranded, baby. It became a lifestyle, and yet, underneath the consumer fluff, the bones of the movement remain. The environmentalism that took root in the 60s, it's now institutionalized. Earth Day, created in 1970, became a global event. The anti-war movement, it reshaped U.S. foreign policy at least for a while. Civil rights, the groundwork laid in those chaotic marches echoed into laws, courtrooms, classrooms. You didn't win every battle, but you changed the battlefield. Take feminism. While it didn't start with hippies, the 60s and 70s gave it momentum. Women who had once been told their place was barefoot in a commune kitchen started organizing, educating, running for office. The push for equal pay, access to contraception, abortion rights, all of it, surged forward thanks to the climate of questioning everything. And music? Don't even get started. Without your psychedelic rock, soul, and protest songs, there's no punk, no grunge, no indie, no alt anything. Bob Dylan went electric. Joni Mitchell went deep. Hendrix went cosmic. And their echoes are still playing in someone's bedroom right now. But let's not romanticize everything. The movement also had its blind spots. Not everyone felt welcome in the hippie dream. The communes were often led ironically by men who still expected women to do the cooking and cleaning while they meditated on the meaning of the universe. Black activists sometimes criticized the movement for ignoring racial injustice in favor of spiritual escapism. Native Americans watched as sacred ceremonies were mimicked in California backyards, with no understanding of what they meant. In short, for all the peace and love, there were still a lot of blindfolds. And drugs? Let's talk about it. Not the glamorized version, the real one. Some people found enlightenment. Some found addiction. LSD opened minds and sometimes broke them. The turn-on, tune-in, drop-out philosophy left more than a few people permanently dropped out. The same psychedelics that help people process trauma and feel connected to the universe also contributed to untreated psychosis, lost years, and burned-out husks of brilliant minds. The DEA didn't miss the chance to use the fallout as an excuse to crack down on the entire movement. Nixon's war on drugs was as much about hippie culture as it was about narcotics. The counterculture became a convenient target painted as dangerous, irresponsible, un-American. Still, the spirit of dissent survived. You see it in modern protests, climate marches, anti-globalization rallies, Black Lives Matter, Occupy Wall Street, the drums, the banners, the sit-ins, the language of the people versus the system. That's all you. The modern activist is wearing sneakers instead of sandals. They've traded in your typewriters for TikTok, but they owe you more than they know. You were the beta version of the modern rebel, the prototype. You didn't finish the revolution, but you made rebellion cool. And now as you sit on your porch, older, maybe wiser, maybe still smelling faintly of patchouli, you can finally take stock. You didn't create paradise. You didn't destroy the system. You didn't end war or capitalism or pollution. But you did do something. You made people question. You made the establishment nervous. You made millions of people consider, for the first time, that the world doesn't have to be the way it is. And that's no small feat. You didn't change everything, but you helped change something. And for a movement born in fields of music, mushroom trips, and rebellious idealisms, that's a legacy worth remembering. You wake up in someone else's van. Again, your head is buzzing. Your mouth tastes like incense and regret, and a guy named Moonbeam is painting your toenails with glitter glue while quoting Nietzsche. It's a Tuesday, in 1968, and the only reason you're not panicking is because the acid hasn't worn off yet. Welcome to the psychedelic revolution. It's not just a trip, it's the trip. A wild ride through altered consciousness, kaleidoscopic visuals, ego, death, and questionable music played at ear-shattering volumes by men who haven't showered since Woodstock. But before we spiral into tie-dye hallucinations, let's hit pause and look at how we got here. The birth of the psychedelic age. In the mid-60s, America was split. On one side, suits and suburbs. On the other, war, civil rights, and a rising generation who wanted to blow open the doors of perception. Enter LSD acid. Discovered in 1938 by Swiss chemist Albert Hofmann, LSD sat unnoticed until the 1960s, when it was picked up by psychologists, pranksters, and eventually everyone in San Francisco. Timothy Leary, a Harvard psychologist turned trippy messiah, coined the phrase, "turn on, tune in, drop out," which roughly translated to abandon your job, forget your responsibilities, and stare at a lava lamp for 4 hours while listening to sitar music. LSD wasn't just a drug. It was a philosophy, an art movement, a mystical practice. And so, metame a really bad idea. What a trip looked like. Picture this. You're lying in Golden Gate Park. The grass is shimmering. The sky just whispered your name. Someone hands you a tab of acid, the size of a postage stamp, printed with a cartoon of Mickey Mouse wearing sunglasses. You swallow it. 30 minutes later, your hands feel like balloons. The trees are breathing. A guy in a poncho is telling you you're the reincarnation of Buddha. You believe him. Sounds fun? Until the trip turns. Suddenly, you're spiraling. The shadows stretch long. Time becomes soup. And you're sobbing into a tambourine because the clouds look like your dad's disappointed face. You want off the ride, but you can't. Not for 8 more hours. That's LSD. Acid tests, merry pranksters, and Ken Kesey's bus. You might think this was all spontaneous. It wasn't. Much of the early psychedelic culture was deliberately engineered by a man in a bus full of lunatics. Ken Kesey, author of One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, teamed up with the Merry Pranksters, a group of artists, dropouts, and spiritual daredevils. They drove across America in a graffiti-covered school bus called Further, spreading chaos and Kool-Aid laced with acid, of course. They hosted acid tests, events where you'd show up, take LSD, and be blasted with strobe lights, distorted music, and the shrieking existential horror of your own subconscious. Sound fun? It was, if you were lucky. If not, you were naked in a bathtub screaming about spiders no one else could see. Psychedelic soundtracks. No trip was complete without music, but not just any music. Psychedelic rock, Jefferson Airplane, The Grateful Dead, Jimi Hendrix, Pink Floyd, Cream. Their songs weren't just music, they were portals. Lyrics about purple haze, electric Kool-Aid, and interstellar overdrive turned your hallucinations into a group experience. Imagine sitting in a crowded room where everyone believes the walls are melting, and that's okay. And here's the crazy part. Most of those albums, written and recorded while on acid. So if the songs sound weird, that's because they were recorded by people who thought the microphone was God. As the 1970s came to a close, the last embers of the hippie movement flickered out, but its echoes would continue to reverberate throughout history. The 1960s and early 70s were, for many, a time of dreams and disillusionment. of visions of utopia that were constantly in flux, an era marked by hope and heartbreak. But while the hippie dream may have faded in the glare of reality, the movement left behind an indelible imprint on the world. The first thing you need to understand is this: the hippie movement wasn't a single, monolithic entity. It was a combination of ideas, music, and culture. It was about change, yes, but it was also about self-expression, individuality, and freedom. For all its flaws, it wasn't just a countercultural rebellion. It was an attempt to do something radically different. The 60s counterculture began with simple ideas like peace, love, and non-violence, but it quickly expanded into a multifaceted revolution that affected art, politics, music, and even sex. If you've ever wondered how today's progressive politics came to be, you can trace much of it back to that rebellious generation of hippies who, in their own flawed way, pushed for new ideas in a world that was stuck in tradition and convention. The lasting influence on music. The music of the hippie era has, in many ways, remained a permanent part of our cultural fabric. The classic songs of the Woodstock generation have been woven into the very identity of modern rock and roll and folk music. The sounds of Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, the Grateful Dead, and The Doors are now more iconic than ever, and they continue to shape the music scene today. The spirit of Woodstock, the idea that music could unite people across different walks of life, is something that is still alive in today's music festivals, albeit in a different form. You see, the hippies' ideals didn't die with their generation. They didn't just fizzle out into the quiet, nondescript suburban life that some of them embraced after they gave up the cause. Those ideals found new life in punk rock, in the hip-hop movements, in the global rise of environmental consciousness, and in the continued fight for human rights and equality. Many of the rebellious youth movements of the 1980s, 1990s, and beyond can trace their roots directly to the countercultural ideas of the 1960s. The end of the dream? Not quite. What the hippie movement couldn't change in the 1960s and 1970s, it was able to influence in the years that followed. Sure, they couldn't end the war, and no amount of flower power could make the world an ideal place where everyone was living in harmony. But the hippie movement did plant seeds that would sprout into the social activism and alternative thinking of future generations. The environmental movement, for example, owes a significant portion of its existence to the hippies. The movement's focus on sustainability, the love of nature, and the spiritual connection to the earth were ideals pushed by hippies long before it became a mainstream concern. By the 1970s, environmental groups were forming, and the first Earth Day was celebrated in 1970, inspired by the same ethos of environmental awareness and respect that the hippies had instilled. And yes, even if peace didn't fully win out over war, the anti-war protests of the 60s and 70s have been influential in future global protests against conflict. The legacy of Vietnam War protests still echoes in modern-day movements that call for an end to military interventions and a call for human rights. Even in the realm of personal liberation, the hippie movement's calls for sexual freedom, gender equality, and liberation of sexual identities laid the groundwork for future societal changes. While the feminist movement of the 1960s was certainly its own entity, the hippie movement helped push the boundaries of what was considered acceptable in society when it came to relationships, gender norms, and personal freedom. The rise of New Age thinking. As the world continued to change, the spiritual side of the hippie movement found a new home in the New Age philosophy. Many people who had followed the hippie path into spiritual exploration began to experiment with alternative religions and philosophies like Buddhism, Taoism, and Hinduism. These ideas, once scoffed at by the mainstream, found fertile ground in the increasingly globalized world. The focus on personal growth and self-awareness would find itself woven into the tapestry of the 1990s and beyond, as millions of people began to explore Eastern philosophy, meditation, and yoga. It's safe to say that the hippie movement had a profound effect on the spiritual landscape of the late 20th century. These ideas are still alive today, in everything from yoga studios to alternative health practices to the growing interest in mindfulness and meditation. The final word, the lasting legacy. While the hippie dream didn't survive as a cohesive movement, It did more than just inspire generations, it changed them. If you've ever felt like you didn't quite fit in with mainstream society or wanted to escape the trappings of capitalism, the hippies were there first, advocating for a simpler, freer way of living. They taught us that revolution doesn't always look like a war, but can come through ideas, creativity, and community. And sure, maybe the dream of a perfect society didn't materialize. Maybe the peace wasn't eternal. But the hippie generation gave us something else, the belief that change is possible, and that we have the power to shape the world in our own image. But let's be honest, would you have survived the chaos of Woodstock, the endless days of smoking joints, and the hopes of changing the world? It might have been a beautiful, colorful dream, but with real people trying to live it, the bumps in the road were inevitable. So, what do you think? Could you have survived the world of 1970s counterculture? Would you have been in the peaceful crowd, shaking your head at the broken promises? Or would you have danced to the music and embraced the free love? The hippie movement may not have been forever, but the spirit of rebellion, individuality, and peace, that's still out there, waiting for the next dreamer to pick up the baton. The legal side, yes, there was one. Of course, the government caught wind of this trippy free-for-all and panicked. LSD had been legal until 1966. That's right, there was a brief golden age when you could buy acid legally and take it in the name of science or self-discovery, or just because it was Thursday. But by the late 60s, the feds cracked down. LSD was banned. Police raided communes. Leary was arrested. The dream turned darker. By 1970, with Nixon's war on drugs looming, the psychedelic playground was officially closed or at least forced underground. Tripping ain't free. LSD wasn't a harmless, sparkly wonder drug. For every mystical vision, there was a bad trip, paranoia, psychosis, jumping off buildings because you thought you could fly, or believing the television was judging your life choices. Some never came back. Others came back, but not all the way. And for all its promise-expanded consciousness, ego dissolution, spiritual awakening, it could also leave you mentally frayed, broke, and living in a van that smelled like wet socks and patchouli. You wouldn't last a day. Let's be honest. You think you'd be the cool one, the enlightened tripper, the cosmic poet. But statistically speaking, you'd probably be the one crying into your lentils, convinced your dog is telepathic and that Nixon is hiding in your closet. Psychedelics weren't recreational. They were existential dynamite. And if you weren't ready, boom. So no, you wouldn't last a day in the psychedelic 1960s. Unless you like your breakfast with a side of existential dread and sitar feedback. By 1969, the hippie movement was peaking. The world had already seen the summer of love, and peace was on the horizon, or so the visionaries hoped. But there was a looming tension between the idealistic dream of the 60s and the harsh realities of the world outside the communes, music festivals, and flower crowns. Enter the Woodstock Music and Art Fair, August 1969, the epitome of hippie culture, peace, and music, and what was intended to be the final, glorious blowout for the movement. As the world stumbled into the late 1960s, political tension was rising. The Vietnam War was dragging on, and with it, so were the protests. The civil rights movement had gained ground, but the reality of inequality still cut deeply in America. And then, in the far corners of the country, a group of young, peace-loving, idealistic rebels said, "Let's do something different." It wasn't just about peace anymore. It was about showing the world that the hippie lifestyle, the ideal of freedom, equality, and love could bring something more to the table than just a bunch of over-enthusiastic pot smokers and barefoot wanderers. It could bring music. In the middle of the rural Catskills in upstate New York, a group of businessmen, yes, even hippies had to make money, decided to create the ultimate expression of their vision for the world. They called it Woodstock. And while it was sold as an Aquarian exposition, 3 days of peace and music, it ended up being a far messier, rain-soaked experiment in communal living, lost expectations, and the force of pure, unrelenting youth. Let's take a step back. Picture the scene. You, the 1960s hippie, in the midst of a sea of muddy boots, amidst thousands of people swarming the grounds in White Lake, New York, The 32-kilometer journey from New York City to the festival was supposed to take a few hours, but because of the sheer mass of humanity heading in the same direction, it turned into an all-night crawl. You had probably dropped some acid because, well, it was the 60s, but all of a sudden, you realized you were surrounded by what looked like an ocean of colorful tents, strange smells, and people dancing like they'd stepped out of a wooden, psychedelic dream. The iconic Woodstock Festival was supposed to have a capacity of 50,000. By the time it started, nearly 500,000 had shown up. The roads leading to the site were a mess. Cars, vans, and buses were abandoned on the highways. People walked for miles to get to the venue, some even trudging through the pouring rain, their psychedelic t-shirts sticking to their bodies, creating a sort of mad, communal, sticky mess. It was as if everything was going wrong, but in the most gloriously hippie way. The organizers had only arranged for enough food, water, and facilities for around 50,000 people, and the food that was available, well, it was a mixture of granola, peanut butter sandwiches, and whatever the crowd had brought along. Vendors sold hot dogs, but they were completely swamped. The toilets? Well, they didn't exactly have enough to handle nearly 1 million people, so everyone was sort of left to do their business wherever they could. Now, here's where the true test of the hippie philosophy was revealed. For all their ideals about peace, love, and unity, the festival goers found themselves juggling basic survival with the hopes of having the time of their lives. Everyone was wet, muddy, hungry, and tired, but somehow they just kept going. Why? Because it was Woodstock, and there was no way you were going to miss the music. The festival was a marathon of cultural experimentation. It was a collision of ideals, music, politics, and chaos that left a mark on history. As you, the average hippie, danced with everyone else, you were caught in a collective euphoria. And it wasn't just from the drugs. For the first time, you saw the whole world in one place, all races, all nationalities, all walks of life, coming together to do something more powerful than protest. They came together to celebrate their freedom. The music? Oh, the music. Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, The Who, and Santana. They all took the stage, while the crowd surged and swayed, lost in a sea of sound and symbols. Hendrix, in particular, set the bar on the night of the 17th of August, when he played the national anthem on his guitar. But this wasn't a patriotic tribute, it was a distorted, war-torn cry that echoed the deep anxieties of a generation. The music was the soundtrack to a generation at war, but it was also an anthem of hope for peace, love, and unity. Yet even this grand experiment couldn't escape the reality of the times. Outside the festival grounds, the world was still burning. The Vietnam War was reaching its peak, and Nixon was getting ready to take office. Inside, people danced and celebrated, but the social fabric was being torn apart. This event, however, was a mark of youth rebellion, even if it wasn't a grand political statement. It was the last stand of the hippie dream before the harsh realities of life began to take their toll. At its peak, Woodstock symbolized the movement's optimism, but it also exposed its flaws. The dream of eternal peace and love couldn't entirely overcome the forces of political corruption, militarism, and capitalism that continued to dominate the country. It was only a few months later that Altamont, the infamous concert featuring the Rolling Stones, took a very dark turn and confirmed that the dream was beginning to break down. The Woodstock experience was as much about climbing down from the clouds of idealism as it was about climbing up to those very clouds. For every moment of peace, there was the reality of chaos creeping around the edges, rainstorms, hungry crowds, and increasing tension. For every song of hope, there were doubts about whether that hope could be turned into something sustainable. So what would have happened if you had been there? You would have likely been fighting the urge to escape when you found yourself standing in a field of hippies, high on acid, covered in mud, trying to figure out where your tent was, and probably trying to ignore the growing anxiety from the smell of weed and unwashed bodies. But despite all the chaos, you would have been caught in the magic of it because, for all its flaws, Woodstock was a moment in time that encapsulated the spirit of the 1960s like nothing else. It was a final hurrah, a loud, boisterous celebration of everything the hippie movement stood for: peace, love, music, and a reminder that No matter how hard you tried, you could never really outrun the realities of life. And while the hippie dream was about to be overtaken by the 1970s, which brought about an era of disillusionment and harsh societal shifts, Woodstock remains a symbol of the hope and promise of a generation. So yes, you were right there in the middle of it, barefoot, laughing in the mud, with no clue that this epic festival would be remembered as the defining moment of hippie culture. As the festival came to a close, you might have found yourself questioning if the ideals of peace, love, and freedom could ever really be achieved. But as you looked around at all the strangers, friends, and dreamers around you, you couldn't help but think that maybe, just maybe, the world had changed, even if it was only for 3 days. And that hope, the one you carried through the mud, the rain, and the heat, was exactly why you couldn't let go of the dream even if the world around you wasn't ready for it. As the haze of the 1960s fades, it leaves behind the faint scent of incense, the distant sounds of psychedelic rock, and the remnants of a generation that once dared to dream. The hippie movement, a patchwork of idealistic visions, colorful festivals, and radical philosophy, became one of the most important cultural phenomena of the 20th century. Yet, like all dreams, it eventually met with the cold waters of reality. Would you have made it? Survived a day in the life of a 1960s hippie? Surrounded by chaos, music, love, and hope? Would you have been able to embrace free love while simultaneously resisting the forces of war and capitalism? In the end, the hippie movement didn't save the world, but it changed the world. Its influence is still felt today in everything from modern social movements to fashion and spirituality. You might not have lasted a day as a hippie in the 1960s, but the ideals they fought for are still alive. And perhaps, just maybe, the dream isn't over yet. The question is, how will you change the world?